A new wave of attempted violence that has many people thinking about our civic and political life with an obvious context tonight. A president who's responded to his liberal opponents being threatened by calling out protests against conservatives, failing to confront his own supporters, suggesting the jailing of one of the very opponents who was targeted yesterday.
No one should carelessly compare political opponents to historical villains, which is done often. It's done all the time. Got to stop. We should not mob people in public spaces or destroy public property.
President Trump went on to use that rally and Twitter today to exploit these attacks as the alleged fault of journalists who are literally among those targeted by some of these attempted bombs yesterday, and also to joke that he was being nice during his political rally. To report the obvious tonight, Donald Trump's partisan and at times glib response to this ongoing security emergency stands in total contrast to past presidents in both parties who faced down their own share of security scares. We put together this historical comparison.
I want to make clear our common determination. An act of vicious terror like this is clearly directed at the spirit of our own democracy.
The media also has a responsibility to set a civil tone and to stop the endless hostility and constant negative and oftentimes false attacks.
We're a kind nation, we're a compassionate nation, we're a nation of strong values, and we value life. Our government is doing everything we possibly can to protect the lives of our citizens, everything.
There are those who like to fan fears, but over the long haul, America does not succumb to fear. We master the moment with bravery and courage.
Normally I'd scream, they want a socialist takeover. Now I say, once a socialist takeover. I'm trying to be nice. Okay. Right?
To look at this comparison and where we're headed, I'm joined by Neera Tanden, who worked for Hillary Clinton and President Obama, who we just saw there, and Ambassador Mark Ginsburg. He served as a White House Middle East advisor as well as an ambassador in the Clinton administration. I begin with you, Ambassador, the comparison.
Well, it's quite evident to me, as someone who's been, unfortunately, a spectator to the president's own rants and raves, Mussolini-style, let's go get them, let's body slam journalists, attacking viciously the opponents of the president and the Democratic Party. Look, Ari, you and I know that when the president eggs on an audience, there are people who are watching at home or in these rallies who consider it to be their duty, if not their civic responsibility, to go out and to harass, as well as to perhaps think about how they can fulfill the president's rhetoric in a way that is, shall we say, goes in a way that is violent. Now, that doesn't mean that the president himself is encouraging that, but let's be real. Those of us who are in the counterterrorism space, counter-extremism space, on YouTube alone, there are 300,000 videos how to construct a pipe bomb. It doesn't take a lot for a lone actor, whether they're incentivized by the president's rhetoric or perhaps incentivized, and I'm merely speculating, by a foreign power to engage in these tactics.
Neera?
Look, the President of the United States, when it has gone after Maxine Waters, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, John Brennan, Robert De Niro, the people who received pipe bombs, who, as far as we know at this point, were, there was basically an attempted mass murder. All of these people are targets that the president has laid out himself in his tweets, in his rallies. And what I find truly shocking is that this happened in our country, and within hours, there was a rally, a political rally, where the president's supporters are chanting, "Lock her up," and the politicians on stage can't say stop. And I think the president, it's the way he is, so no one's really shocked by it, that he'll blame the media or blame someone else. But the fact that we have a president who, unlike any other president, targets people, they are then the targets of attack and can't say the simple words that, I'm going to do better, or recognize his own role of this, is truly disconcerting. It's just outrageous and ridiculous. But truly, we've all lost words to describe the ridiculous situation that we're in with President Trump.
Ambassador, what do you think is the responsibility of people who've served like you have in national security and diplomatic positions within the government to try to reason with someone who, in the rally last night, at best appeared very glib, very unserious about this, and at worst, as many have suggested, appears to fan the flames of a climate where people are really going beyond the traditions and political norms that are basically a requirement of a peaceful civic society?
Well, when you have a White House staff that can't deal with this president effectively and actually get into fistfights with each other, so they exert violence within their own White House when they disagree with each other, the only way that I can think of, Ari, is that people of good intent, good Americans, all of us who are Republican, Democrat, Independent, the best way to show the president that his glibness and his indifference, if not back of the hand attacks still on the press. I wish he would say, and I call on Fox News to stop its fake news attacks on Democrats. I haven't heard him say that. Mm-hmm. Let's face it, it's going to take voters to go to the polls and vote and put a Democratic majority in the House, if not in the Senate, in order to tell the president the American people are tired and sick and tired of this type of rhetoric that is inflaming and putting the best lives of our country in danger.
Well put, and something to think about. Ambassador Ginsburg, thanks for joining us. Neera, stick around. I want to ask you about another development later in the show. And now, as promised, turn to another guest of ours, a current member of Congress, Hakeem Jeffries, representing New York. Thanks for being here during a difficult time for New York and a lot of parts of the country.
Thanks for having me.
Your view of how the president is conducting himself and what is the nature of the threat as you see it in these attacks?
Well, it's a serious threat that has targeted two former presidents, high-ranking governmental officials, and public figures who have been very critical of the president. That's a very troubling pattern that suggests that there was provocation based on the politics of the moment that we're in. Words matter. Leadership is important. It starts at the top. And the president has chosen to respond to the chaos, crisis, and confusion of the moment by basically showing depraved indifference to human life. And that's been shameful and shocking. And the only way for the American people to respond through their goodness is going to be through the power of the ballot that has been given to us by our founding fathers to show that this is not okay, that we are better than this, and to impose a check and balance on this president on November 6th.
So you think he's making it worse?
He absolutely is making it worse. Presidents can either unite or they can divide. They can either bring people together or they can tear us apart. And Donald Trump has clearly chosen to tear us apart by showing indifference at best and definitely provocation at worst in terms of what has taken place. It's not even clear that he has the ability to show human compassion for what has taken place, and that is perhaps the biggest tragedy of it all. He's been on this earth for 70+ years. It's clear to us that he is not going to change.
He said yesterday during his more scripted part of this, well, we have to accept the outcome of elections. But he was the first modern nominee of a major party who said at a presidential debate in front of everyone that he wouldn't agree in advance to accepting the outcome of the election. He would wait and see until Election Day, and he happened to win. I wonder what you think of that contrast and the debate that's going to continue, I think, as long as he's president, about when he comes out and he says the bare minimum of what he seems to be assigned or what's unscripted, and then goes on and acts in a way that's contra to whatever was written for him.
Well, he's someone who clearly has authoritarian tendencies, and when given the chance, he always shows us who he is. Initially, he'll respond based on a script, show some humanity, but then when he's unleashed from the script or the teleprompter, basically communicate what he really thinks about the matter. And that is quite unfortunate, because this is not a situation where it's Democrats versus Republicans, the left versus the right, progressives or conservatives. This is a life or death matter. This is when leadership is really required at the top, and he has failed the American people.
Congressman Hakeem Jeffries from New York, a place that knows these threats well. I appreciate you coming on our coverage tonight. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.